Hi everybody, my name is Amy McPherson. I'm a Métis designer. I'm from Winnipeg, Manitoba, but I was born and raised in Dauphin. Today we're going to be doing a tutorial on putting together a pair of moccasins. I've already put together the first one, so we're going to be doing a moccasin with your regular rabbit fur. We've got a welt in between the vamp. There's no beadwork on this slipper. I'm just going to show you how to put it together and we'll get started. So I have on the table here everything that you're going to need to put your slipper together. So I'm going to go through everything I have here. We have your design. So this is what the bottom of your slipper looks like. Always making sure that you're putting the notches. So there's one notch on the side here, one here, and then one at the center. This is a size ladies 8, but I do have access to all the sizes. So if you contact the Northwest Métis Council, they can assist you with the certain size that you need. So this is the base of the slipper. We need to cut a piece out of your leather. And you also need to cut out a piece of your lining. So your slipper lining is just a regular pilled lining. You could get this at any fabric store. You could cut up an old sweater. You could use an old blanket, anything you want to use for practice in the beginning if you don't want to go out and purchase slipper lining. So anything to just really keep your foot warm. So you want to have your base, your leather piece, your lining piece, and then this is what we call the vamp. This is this part here. So this is going to be this part. Now, if you wanted to make a beaded pair of moccasins, you would bead your vamp first. So you take your vamp piece and you would do your beadwork on to the vamp, and then you would put your slipper together. We got the vamp, we've got the leather piece, and you got your lining. So you want to have all these pieces cut out, and as I said, always make sure that you're marking the notches. So you got a notch in the leather, just a little snip, or mark it with a pen is fine. You got your center, and you got your other notch. So if you look closely, there's also notches in the vamp. So there's one on each side. You can see it on the vamp when I hold. So there's one at the top and one on each side. And basically, those notches help put it together. So you're gonna need all your pieces. And this is what we call the welt. So you're gonna need to cut out a piece of leather. I like to make this nice edging with the pinking shear. So you can do that just with this scissors. It's called a pinking shear and it kind of looks like little triangles. So that cuts a nice little decorative edging. So what I've went ahead and done is I've done a contrasting color just for ease of this tutorial. So we're gonna go ahead and cut whatever kind of piece of leather. Some people use ribbon, fabric that's just folded over. It's really your preference. So what that's gonna do is it's gonna go in between. It's gonna hide your stitches and gonna give you a nice little edging there. As far as your needle, we are going to use what you call a Glover needle. This leather needle is called a Glover and it's for leather. And if you look closely, it's got 3 edges. So it's like a triangle and it's really sharp. So it's going to puncture the leather and then there's going to be a hole in your leather. This is a thicker needle. This is a size 3. I like to use a size 3 because it's nice and strong. It's thick and you're going to have no problem going through 2 layers of leather, 3 even with this welt. So you got to get yourself a leather Glover. I like to use a binder clip or an office clip. That works too. I found these at the dollar store. They work handy for me when you're sewing your stuff together. Because you can't pin leather, which is if you're making a garment or any piece of clothing, or even if you're just sewing together your lining, you could just use a pin to pin it. But because you can't put a pin in leather, because once you put a hole in leather, then the hole is there. So I like to hold it together with a nice little clip, and these just seem to work really well. You can sew with a couple different things. I personally like to use imitation sinew when I'm sewing leather moccasins together because it's really strong, like there is no breaking this. So I'll show you how to separate the imitation sinew, or you could also use some nylon thread. This is really strong too. I purchased this at Canso in Winnipeg, and it's bonded nylon. So it's got a little bit of a, I don't want to say like a waxy, but it's really strong and it's made out of nylon, 100% nylon. So it's very strong. So you can use, this is like a leather kind of a color. So you can use this. I have used this before, but today I'm going to go ahead and use the imitation sinew. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take a piece, just cut it down. And then you want to separate it into about 4 or 5 strands. So you can see that if you just kind of give it a little shake, it separates on its own. And this is the same thing that real sinew does. So if you were to do all the hard work to get the real sinew off backstrap, then it actually has it's fibrous and it just comes apart like that too. So you just want to take pieces off. You want to make about 4 or 5 threads out of that one piece. So this is what we're going to go ahead and use. I'll put this aside and I'll take another piece off later when I'm ready. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to thread our Glover needle with our one piece of sinew. And I like to use a double thread, so I'll put a knot using both ends. So we take both ends and we put a knot. And I like to go 2 knots, and then we're gonna start. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go right sides together. So you wanna take the outside, like the bottom of your slipper, and the front top of your moccasin, and you wanna go right sides together. So you're gonna be doing your stitch inside out. In between the 2 pieces of leather, you wanna add your welt. You want these little triangles to be pointing up, like on the moccasin, right here. So what you're gonna do is they're gonna be facing down. So I like to start right at the middle, right at the top little notch there. So you're gonna lay down your welt, and then you're gonna lay your notch, and you got your notch on the top, and you're matching it right up to that notch on the bottom. And this is where the clips come in. So I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna take a clip, I'm gonna hold it down. Now what you wanna do is just kind of work the welt along the vamp, the smaller piece, up until your little notch, okay? And then you're gonna find your notch on the slipper, on the bottom, and you're gonna match those 2 notches up. And you're gonna go ahead and clip it. Some people put a little stitch to hold it in place if you don't have any little clips or anything like that, and that's the way I started out as well. It just holds it together really nicely, because once you start, stitching it together, sometimes it shifts a little over to the side, and you don't want that to happen. So this is why we pin it, or we put a stitch in those notches to hold everything into place. So we're gonna go ahead and follow along the vamp with the welt up into the notch. And we're gonna match the notch up, and we're gonna pull it together, and we're gonna clip it. It's gonna look like this, and you're gonna think, well, that doesn't match up. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna add some gathers right here, and that's gonna bring it closed. Right here on the moccasin, we're gonna gather it around the edge. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna stitch an overstitch, so through, up and over, like that, and we're gonna go straight up into when this starts. There's a gap there. So we're gonna go straight from here up, and then we're gonna tie a knot, and then we're gonna come from this side, and we're gonna go straight up, and we're gonna tie a knot. This technique helps from it shifting, going like that. If you ever see a moccasin that kind of like, it doesn't look like it's sitting right, it kind of goes like this, and you'll be able to see that. That's why, because as they're sewing, it shifts like that. We're trying to alleviate that. And by doing that, we're gonna stitch up along this side, and then we're gonna stitch up along this side, so then there'll be an open spot at the top, and then we're gonna go ahead and gather that area. We'll take our double-threaded Glover needle. Once you have your needle through, now I can go ahead and take this clip off because I don't need it anymore. So through, up and over, and back in. Some people put a little mark on their fingernail or on their finger, just kind of guiding them. I like my stitches to be about maybe 1/8 of an inch or so. So 1/8 of an inch apart from each other, and 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the leather. You don't want it getting too close because it could rip out. So you want it to be about 1/8 of an inch over and 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the leather. So we're gonna go and do a whip stitch, and we're gonna go as far as it stays straight. So it's gonna go about 4 inches on this moccasin. And then once it stops laying straight, then we're gonna stop, and you'll be left with a little opening there. And you see how nice and easy that Glover needle goes through 3 pieces of leather I'm going through right now. You may need a Glover, you may need a thimble. If you need a thimble, this is the time you want to use it. The reason why I like using a nice big Glover needle is because it's super strong, it's not gonna bend, it's not gonna break, and I don't need a thimble. So make sure that all 3 layers are all parallel and all matching up at the edge. So you can see about how far apart my stitches are and about how far from the top they're going. So we're just gonna keep going up until it stops matching and being even right about there, and then we'll tie a knot. With your left hand, you can hold your layers together. Whip stitch those 3 layers, making sure you're getting that welt in there. So you wanna make sure you catch that. only got maybe another 2 or 3 stitches until it stops matching up straight without that gap. So I'm probably gonna do 1 more and then we'll tie it off. So you can see I've come up one side up until about 4 inches or so, up until it starts. So if I were to go, like I could go all the way and it would be even, but then, you know, you need to have enough gather around the toe. So you're thinking, just think from around your toes. You just want that part to be gathered. You don't want the sides gathered, you just want that top round part. So we're gonna go ahead and tie this side off and do the same thing, working our way up the other side. And we're gonna start on the other side. So I'm gonna go ahead and take that clip off because I'm holding it in place here with my left hand, and I'm gonna go ahead and start whip stitching up this side. So what we're gonna do when we're done sewing it all together, all of this stitching in the seam is going to be on the inside. So we're gonna flip it all inside out, and then it's going to be all the stitches you won't be able to see because they're gonna be on the inside. Then the lining will be in there, so it'll be kind of like tucked away in between the lining and the leather. So you can see about how far away my stitches are from each other and about how far they are from the edge of the leather. You know, you're gonna wanna come up this side about the same distance as that one. So I've got about another 4 or 5 stitches to go. So it looks like 1 more should be enough. And then we will make a knot, but not cut it. So now we've got our sides sewn up. They're about even on each side. We went straight up, and we're gonna go ahead and put a knot now, but we're not gonna cut it because we're gonna continue on with the gather now. So we're gonna go ahead and put a knot, and the knot is because in case you make an error while you're gathering, you just need to undo that, and you don't need to undo the whole thing. So you would just undo up to that knot. So now as you're gathering, what you wanna do is you wanna put a small little bump on the outside, the side that has the gap, not the vamp. And you're gonna do the same kind of stitch, whip stitch up and over, and you're gonna make sure that you have a little bit of that little bump, and that little bump creates the gather. Now you want your stitches to stay the same width apart, the same distance from the edge. You just wanna add that little bit of gather. And the closer you are to the straight line, the smaller the gather. The gather can get bigger as you get to the toe because it needs to come up and around a little bit higher around the toes. So we will go ahead and do another small little gather and then come up and over. And you can see how once the stitch goes down, it kind of pops up like that, creating that gather. And that's where you see, this is what creates this gather around the toes. Because you want that flat piece, you want it to kind of come up and over your toes like that. And by gathering it here, it pulls it like that. This is a little tricky part, so it will take some getting used to. So that's why I recommend tying the knot after the straight stitch, because if you aren't happy with your gather and you want to take it out, you're only taking it out up to there and then you start over with the gather. You're not having to put the whole thing together again. As you get closer to the center, you want to make sure that your notches are staying even along each other, and you want to make sure that you're going to have enough leather to keep gathering all the way to the middle. This is why I suggest starting off along the straight line with smaller gathers, and if you find you need to get bigger towards the center, I'm getting closer to the center, so I'm going to take the clip out, but make sure that your notches are lining up. All right, so here we are with our straight stitch up on each side, and now we're gonna go ahead and gather the toe. What we're gonna do is we're gonna gather around the toe so that the leather kind of folds up and around your toes. So we're gonna go ahead and do the same overlapping stitch, the overstitch that we did, but we're gonna add a little pucker. Each time we take a stitch, we're gonna, from the outside piece, we're gonna add a little wee pucker like that, and then we're gonna come on the other side of it so it holds it. Okay, so you can see how these little puckers are starting to form. Making sure you're catching that welt with each stitch. As we get closer to that center clip, we can get ready to take it out, making sure that our notches are lining up. So you can see the pucker being created right there. Now I'm gonna go ahead and take this out of my way, but I'm gonna hold on, making sure that those notches are still together. Couple more stitches until we meet the center. And if you see, like right now, there's the notch and there's the notch. It doesn't look like it's gonna match up. But with those puckers and those gathers, it brings it in to match up. That's what your goal is. So now, by adding that pucker, you see how my notches now match up. We're gonna carry on and fill this side with our puckers. So now you don't need any more clips. You're done with that. And you're just gonna make sure that there's no extra space here. So you want to do the majority of your puckers here, making sure that there's enough space to do some here. So we're gonna go ahead and carry on, adding your pucker, making sure that your welt is in between, and gathering your pieces together. So you see those puckers coming up and creating that around your toes. So we're almost done, and you see I'm still have more, but that's gonna close up as I make those puckers. So if you feel like you don't have it, like it's not gonna work, it's gonna work. Just keep up with those puckers. So see, now the last stitch, there's still a little bit, but that's just enough to do another 1 or 2 puckers. So now we are done our pucker. I'm gonna go ahead and knot this off. I'll give you a quick show and then we'll flip it around and have a look. So this is what the inside of your moccasin will look like from the inside. And what you can see is where we went straight up, and we went straight up on this side, and then we gathered it around the toe. So let's see, let's turn it inside out. We'll have a look, see what it looks like. So there you have it. There is your moccasin. So you got the nice welt, all your gathers, and then we're gonna go ahead, you can cut these the little tags off in the welt. So you can go ahead and cut these off. We'll just trim them off. They can just be cut off like that. So you don't need those no more. So now we're gonna go ahead and I'm gonna show you how to close up the heel. So we're gonna do the heel. Now again, we can leave it right side out, but what we're gonna do is we're gonna flip it like this, so that your stitches are always on the inside hidden. So also we're gonna stick a welt in the back. So on this one, I used a contrasting welt for the video, but in the back, I'm just gonna use a regular same color of brown. Here we are with our finished moccasin, well, the finished gather, putting the vamp on. This is what you call the vamp. And so we are going to close up the heel. So you just cut yourself a little strip of leather again, about, half an inch or so. And you can certainly use the pinking shears to create this little, triangle design if you want. It's just a matter of which scissors you use. So we're gonna go ahead and slipper side up, right side up. We're gonna take the heel and we're going to fold it backwards. Your stitches are gonna be on the inside. You don't wanna see them on the back of the slipper. You want it to look like that. So we're gonna go ahead and match the sides up and we're gonna cut a little piece. So that's half the back heel. We're gonna take this little piece and we're just gonna measure it. So you're gonna cut some off because there will be a little tag. So you're gonna take your welt and 1 inch up from the bottom, the heel, you're gonna come 1 inch up and then you're gonna lay your welt in there. You need to leave a little hole at the base of the heel, and I'll tell you why. That little space right there is gonna turn into this heel seam right there. So you can't close it up because we need to cut that off. So you wanna go 1 inch up, about you know, to your knuckle, and then you're gonna put that welt in the middle. And then you're gonna stitch up those 3 pieces of leather around your whip stitch, and you're gonna close up that seam. So you're gonna start in here, an inch from the base, an inch from the middle, add your welt, and sew out. We're at the last stitch here. So what I like to do to tie it off is, here's my needle, here's my stitch. I just like to run it through and tie it, and then make another knot. And from there, you can cut off that little tail of your welt, and you can cut your sinew. All right, so now that we're done stitching up the back seam there of the heel, we are going to lay it down flat and kind of make a triangle out of it. So you want it to look like this. And now you're gonna take where you left that 1 inch open, and you're gonna cut it right straight across without cutting any of those stitches. So we're gonna go into a triangle, get the points nicely, and you're gonna cut that triangle right off straight across. So we're gonna make sure that it's all even, flat, center. Here's the center of your toe. You want it to line up with that seam, and then you're gonna go ahead and cut that off. So I'm gonna take it and I'm just gonna cut it off. And it's gonna be like that, just like that. And then what I like to do is that little piece you cut out, just make a little welt out of it. It's almost the perfect size already. And you're just gonna stick that in there, and you're gonna stitch that up the same way as you did this back seam, right across, one end to the other, making sure that you got that little welt in there. So you're gonna line all of those 3 pieces of leather up, and you're gonna stitch that down. Okay, last stitch. And then you make your double knot. So like I said, that last hoop, for some reason I just like to, you know, do that and then make a knot. So then you got your T-stitch across the heel, up the back, flip it inside out, and there you go. All your seams are on the inside, and that is going to fit nicely. Now if you want to trim those down, by all means, you can totally trim those down, making sure you're not snagging anything. So if you want to trim that down, and like I said, if you want to use the pinking shears, you can go ahead and do that now. And it ends up with a nice little detail like that. Now, there's the shell of your moccasin. So what we're gonna do quickly now is we're gonna put together the lining. Now the lining is a lot easier, and we don't need to do it inside out because you don't want the seams showing. So we're gonna go the same thing as we went ahead and did the moccasin. We're gonna match up those notches, and we're gonna match up the side notches, but this time we want right sides together, so that when we gather it, and we don't need a welt in the lining, when we gather it, there's no seams exposed to the foot, because it'll get hard on your foot, those knots, you'll feel that. So this is the opposite. We're not gonna have to turn it inside out. The stitching is gonna be on the top. I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and then we'll be ready to put our fur on. So I am gonna go back to the nylon thread for the lining instead of using the sinew, and just your whip stitch around. And your stitches can be bigger, your stitches can be wider on the lining. It doesn't need to be as tight. And if you're feeling brave, you can go ahead and try to go all the way around without any knots on the lining, making sure that your center notch is always even. So I'm gonna go ahead and make my puckers, and they can be bigger on the lining as well. They don't need to be as tight as in the leather. And if you wanted to practice your puckers on the lining first, that might be a great way to go about it, just to do your lining first. It's easier, it puckers easier, and you kind of get a feel for it. You might just want to put your lining together first. You get a feel of how it goes together, and then you can go ahead and start with your leather. And if you don't want or don't have any leather at home, and you want to just try, you know, just to learn the technique and just practice, cut up an old sweater, sew it together, see how it goes together, you know, use anything to practice. If you have an old jacket or something that nobody uses anymore, and you have no more kids or relatives to give it away to, cut it up. All right, so here we are, finished the gather on the lining, and I'm gonna go ahead and sew up the back seam the same way as I did on the leather with no welt. As you noticed, the lining, the seam is on the outside, and so when it goes into the slipper, all the seams are on the inside. So go ahead and put your lining. We don't want the seams on the inside, so we wanna 1 inch away from the edge. So 1 inch away from the heel. About, I measure up to my knuckle, that's about 1 inch for me. Sew up the back. Just your regular old whip stitch, up and over. Tie your knot and close up your heel. So what are we gonna do now? We're gonna put it into a triangle. We're going to cut that corner off, right across the top there, straight across, make sure everything is even. You want the center of your toe straight along that seam. You'll cut that off. So there's the little piece you want to cut off, and we're going to stitch that closed. Knot it up. And there we have your slipper lining. The final step to your moccasin is attaching the fur. We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna put it into your shell. Now, if you notice that where we had the notches, there's a little bit of extra. So we're actually gonna cut that off. And you're gonna notice that it's on here as well, because you wanna be able to get your foot in. So we need to trim a little bit of that off, and then that's what we'll attach the fur to. So we're gonna go first ahead and fit the lining in to the shell of the moccasin. Push the toes way up into the back, to the top there, fit them in nicely. So when you're done, your moccasin lining should fit nicely into the shell, just like that. So what we want to do though is we want to trim this little piece down. We want to leave enough space from that edge to that seam. We want to leave enough space so that we have enough leather to grab onto to sew the fur on. So you can see here's my notch, here's my other notch. This is where I cut off the welt. Cut this welt off, just line up that lining evenly, and we're going to trim some of that off. So we're not going all the way up to the notch, we're just going probably halfway. We're gonna go ahead and cut that off. Across that way, it's still got a little bit of a lip to be able to sew your fur onto. So we're gonna go ahead, and what I use is I buy a big fur pelt of rabbit, and I go ahead and I cut strips. The size of strips that I like to use is 2.5 inches. So it's 2.5 inches this way. And the pelts are about, like, it's rabbits all sewn together into a big square. So that's what I buy, and I just cut strips like this. Really easy, and it makes a nice fluffy edging of rabbit fur. So you want a nice fluffy fur, and so the shorter you cut the fur, the less it's gonna come around, the less fluffy. So where I like to start with my fur is I like to start right around the back seam here, because then we're gonna sew around, and then that seam where we attach it together can just be parallel with that back seam. Okay, so this is where the clips come in handy again. And the way you put the fur on is you want the fur to be facing inside. It feels a little funny, like it's not gonna work out. But what happens is when you pull it over, then it's the right side out. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and make sure that your fur is always laying down. Because if you attach it this way, that's the wrong way. Then that fur will be like that, but you want it to be coming down. So you want to make sure that you're stitching on the top side of the fur, and the fur is laying flat down this way. So we're going to lay it, and I'm going to line up that back seam, all 3 layers, and I'm going to go ahead and clip it. I'm going to go do that all the way around. This gets messy, so make sure you have cutting fur, working with fur. It gets messy, so make sure you have like a lint roller or one of those sticky things. There's lots of fur left over, but we want to actually have a little bit of extra and then cut it at the end. So now that we have it pinned, you could just roll the tail up and stick it in there for now. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go back to sinew and I'm gonna double knot my sinew on my Glover needle. And because you're going through, leather, lining, and fur, you may want to use a thimble at this point. Totally up to you. If you have a strong enough Glover, you shouldn't necessarily need a thimble, but everybody's different. So I'm gonna go ahead and knot double thread on my Glover, and I have my seam on my rabbit fur that's meeting up this back heel seam. So I'm gonna go ahead and take this clip out because it's gonna be in my way. And I'm gonna go ahead and I'm going to do a whip stitch over, up and over, up and over, up and over, the stitch that we've been doing all along. So I'm gonna go ahead and same width and distance, away from the edge, away from each stitch. So I'm gonna go ahead and just quickly put the fur on with my whip stitch and work my way around. A little tricky around the corners, but just make sure that everything is lining up, all three edges. And then you could just take a piece of tape or some of that sticky thing and get all that fur off after. I usually like to use a razor blade to cut my fur. I didn't bring one with me, so we'll just, I'll show you how to use scissors, but it's a little tricky. And I'm just gonna keep stitching right up into that last stitch that I had when I started on the other side. So this is where I started, and I'm gonna go right back up to it. So I'm going to make one more stitch here, and then I'm gonna go ahead and knot it. I'm not gonna cut it, just gonna knot it. Now you have your tail hanging over, and this is your other piece of fur that we're gonna stitch up the back. So what you wanna do is you wanna kinda line it up, and then you wanna cut this one just slightly a little longer than this side. And I'll show you how to go and cut fur with the scissors. I'd use a fine scissors. I usually use a razor blade because it's skin. You want to cut from the back side and then the fur separates. Or if you go and try and cut fur with a scissors, the fur just goes everywhere. So what I'm going to do with this fine scissors is I'm just going to try and get in the skin only and try and just cut the skin instead of, because there'll be hair everywhere. So I'm going to see if you can. So I'm gonna slide this blade of my scissors along that skin, and I'm just gonna work a little bit at a time so that I'm not cutting through all that fur. So you're just trying to get that skin. So usually if you just use a scissors, and you're not like you're cutting through all that fur. So I did cut through some, and that's what's coming off here. So now we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna, push the fur, the inside, and kind of just try and line up the skin like this along the back. So then we're gonna take our thread that's still attached, and we're gonna whip stitch up that back seam. So we're gonna go and do from one side of that fur up to the other. Cut that thread. And there you have your moccasin. We're ready to flip the fur out and see how nice it looks. So go ahead and flip your fur out. There you go. Oh, they're so nice. And here you go. Here is your finished pair of moccasins. Thank you very much for participating in this tutorial, and happy moccasin making.